Please. Circumstances have changed, all right?
Welcome to Decoding TV's coverage of The Gentleman Season 1, streaming right now on Netflix. There are 8 episodes live right now. Patrick Klepek and I have watched all 8, and the show has been renewed recently for Season 2, so we will see more from the world of The Gentleman. Before we talk about what actually happened this season, Patrick Klepek, in one sentence or less, do you think people should watch the show?
Absolutely. This is some of the most fun I've had watching a TV show in a hot minute. It is just fun characters, breezy watching, exceptionally funny, just a really good time. Like the best of Guy Ritchie and the worlds and characters he trots out. The Gentleman was, I think, start to finish, a total blast.
Wow. I had a lot of fun with it as well. And I do think if you're looking for something peppy and cheap, or not really peppy and cheap, because this show looks really expensive, peppy and expensive, a lot of fun, you should check out the show. I do think kind of starts to fall apart a little bit by the end of season 1, but overall, I also had a pretty good time with the show. Some of the best time I had watching TV this year was actually watching like a few of the episodes of this season. So overall, had a blast. Then had some issues as we wrapped up the end of the show. Okay. I want to talk about some other overall thoughts on the show. So overall, we recommend the show, but like the analogy came to me, Patrick Klepek. This is basically like Entourage for British gangsters.
That's
what I mean by that is it's completely inconsequential. Like as a show, it feels completely inconsequential. It has a main lead who is extremely talented right away, and who in general everything seems to just work out for, right? Like and there's this colorful cast of characters, and you like to see them banter with each other and bounce off each other. At the end of the day, none of this really matters, and the show doesn't take itself too seriously. But we can all have a little bit of fun there. So that's kind of what, as I was watching, I was like, this is like Entourage for British gangster shows, right? That's what this is, the Entourage for British gangster shows. Patrick Klepek, what do you think of that analogy?
Yeah, it's not something I found myself thinking about too much in the moment, which is a testament to how thoroughly entertaining the show is minute to minute. Yeah, there are no real consequences for just about anybody in this show. It is not really about characters becoming smarter over time, learning things. Like the show gestures at that at various points, mostly just because of pre-existing character dynamics, but I don't know that I would argue characters go on much of an arc throughout this show. Yeah. It's more that for 8 episodes of television, you watch a bunch of sexy, charismatic people be sexy and charismatic and go on hijinks. And that's difficult to sustain for 8 episodes. And although it's not perfect, I'd say it hits more than it misses. And that's the part that I was kind of shocked at by the end. And also the fact that the show manages to not fall into some of the missteps that I was worried about. I know that when we first reviewed the first couple episodes, like, is this whole show going to be about like the older brother, like dealing with this fuck up younger brother, right? And just, that's just going to be what the show hangs its hat on. And pretty much right after that, like the initial plot line of that wraps up. Not that Freddie isn't sort of a continued sort of like problem for Eddie, a foil, but he's not a central. It's not a central dynamic. It very quickly shifts to Eddie and Susie. It recognizes that's the strongest part of the show. It never drifts too far into the will they or won't they romance part of it. It's there, but it's not like a show about when are they going to have sex. It's just a very smart, fun, sexy show that I think because it doesn't take itself too seriously. If it did, suddenly you'd start thinking about the things you're talking about. Like, why aren't there consequences? Like, why isn't there more actual tension in this show in regards to what will or won't happen? But then you go, I don't seem to really care. So I'm just going to click on the next episode and keep watching.
Here are some things that the show does really well, right? Like it really captures some of the stuff that Guy Ritchie does best. It's a colorful cast of characters. Like all these characters have different characteristics. Like the casting is really well done. Visually, all the characters are quite distinctive, right? And that's something that Guy Ritchie does well. You have lots of monologuing about esoteric material. Like you can just watch a character and be like, here's a history of carrier pigeons. Here's a history of like how they make alcohol. Here's a history. Like you just have characters sitting there, British gangster sitting there and just kind of giving a monologue about some random topic, and it's very and it's like a lead up to, and that's why I need to kill you right now, or whatever it is, right? Like the show looks amazing. It looks like every episode. This show looks like every episode cost as much as the Acolyte cost. Like it's like there's all these different settings. There's tons of background actors. There's fairly elaborate set pieces
It
sometimes.
feels like real people, real places, right? I'm sure that if you saw a VFX reel for this, you'd be shocked, like you always are, at like how much effects work is happening to convince you you're in these places. But part of what goes a long way is like, doesn't matter how much money is or isn't spent, or how much is or isn't physical versus like practical versus like effects. Do you feel like you're in the place?
Yes.
This show
yes
makes me feel like at no point am I ever glancing at the show and be like, they're not here. Obviously, it's easier. It's not like a fantastical sci-fi realm, but I was always bought in on the characters and what they're undergoing because I bought the world around them, even if it's a hyper fantastical, exaggerated version of gangster life.
Yeah. I think plot wise, like the show is also a lot of fun because you meet all these characters throughout the season, and then like by the end of the season, they all are like referenced or they come back in some way, and it makes it feel like, oh, this is a world we're living in, as opposed to just we're cruising through a bunch of these cameos or whatever they might be. It feels like, oh wow, these people, these characters are all interconnected and their actions impact each other, and I like that a lot. Guy Ritchie's recent aesthetic is kind of interesting. The thing I would compare this TV show more to is not The Gentleman the movie. Honestly, in terms of feel, it reminds me more of Wrath of Man. I don't know if you saw that movie. But Wrath of Man like opened with all these like big chapters and like chapter 1 and like all these big pretentious titles and had like all this classical music and stuff like that. And that's kind of what this show is. It's some of the most silly stuff imaginable is happening on screen, or goofy stuff imaginable, and then you have this like choral music in the background with these big titles that that are like very ponderous, like prepare for all eventualities, and like not without pain, or whatever the episode, and so it's like I think it makes for an interesting combination, and it largely works. This is overly simplistic, but I feel like it's lowbrow stuff disguising itself as highbrow stuff.
Yeah.
And it works for me. It works for like I find that a very kind of fun tone to play with. So anyway, let's talk about some of the specific stuff that happens this season. To remind you, The Gentleman revolves around Eddie Horniman, who's minding his own business working as a UN peacekeeper, when all of a sudden he's called back home, and he's shocked to learn that he is the new Duke of Halstead after the passing of his father, and he has inherited the entire estate. Unfortunately, his brother Freddie thinks the throne belongs to him, and he's also just generally not very bright. Eddie meets Susie Glass, who helps her father, Bobby, run a massive weed dealing operation right out of Eddie's estate, which, by the way, is also an estate that's of great interest to Stanley Johnston, played by Giancarlo Esposito, who wants to buy it and potentially move into the meth dealing business. Patrick, I think one of the big challenges of the show is Eddie remains kind of a cipher throughout the entire thing. I don't know if you agree with that. Like, I don't think this character really grows or changes at all. He wants to get out from under Bobby Glass, but like why that's true is not really clear. Like, what is he going towards? Other than just vaguely, he doesn't want to be under the thumb of a British gangster. Like
family?
Family, I guess, but like, why not just continue the arrangement?
Isn't it best if your family to just like not be involved in this anymore?
Right, like it's the show doesn't do a good job of establishing why it is he cares so much, I think, about this whole situation. And then obviously at the end, it turns out he actually does want to be a criminal. He just didn't want to be reporting to this guy, and that was fanatically important to him to not be reporting to this guy, but then he ends up reporting to the guy anyway. So it's like that all is kind of like pretty muddled to me, and that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the show, I think, is the character of Eddie Horniman, and like very competent, super competent at doing this right away, doesn't seem to love doing it, and like but then like does by the end, and I couldn't really track his journey. What do you think, Patrick?
Well, we're in full spoiler territory now, right?
Yes, we're in full spoilers now.
So the show. I think one of the moments where the show doesn't quite earn the drama that it's setting up because it doesn't do enough of the work to give Eddie like a real arc to hang on to is that moment at the end when like he offers up to Susie an opportunity to kill the person that put her brother into a coma. He said, well, why don't you do it? It's like, can you do it? Can you prove you can get to the next level? Now, granted, we cut away. We don't see what happens, but I think it's heavily implied that like my man Eddie just holds up that gun, doesn't look, and like just pulls the trigger and coldly kills this man in cold blood. And I think it's meant to be like hey, like look where this character has gone. But part of what makes Eddie fun throughout the rest of the show is like he's this really attractive, put together, like we have a vague sense of like he's seen things, which is going to help explain like why he's hyper competent, like when he's caught like fighting with someone or in an otherwise weird like aggressive situation. I think the show does enough work with him for you to buy why he can stumble his way through a bunch of extraordinary gunfights and fistfights and things like that. But I don't buy any of the emotional needle drop that is supposed to happen at the end here. Like, can't believe this character has come this far, where now he's ready to just pull the trigger on this guy at the end because he's ready to take it to the next level. That felt like the show being a little out of its depth, or like not recognizing the shallow pool that it's been playing in for the duration of the show. That I'm fine with, but I didn't really buy that little sequence, that little setup at the end. And I think the show even making that something it feels like we need to bear witness to is almost the show not fully understanding the journey it's been on with this character or lack thereof in the the episodes prior.
I had a very different reaction, or similar reaction in some ways, in the sense that moment did not register for me at all in the way that you described it. And the reason is because I thought he was already there the whole time. Like he arrives fully formed. Right?
Yes,
he arrives. I'm already ultra competent at all this. So the idea that he's going to have any qualms about murdering this guy at the end just didn't make any sense. I mean, he's introduced helping to cover up another killing, right? So it's like,
right.
The idea that this would be a big move for him. For me, the moment was more a significance in terms of, oh, he and Susie are like, they have patched things up. Like that's because they've been kind of at odds for the previous several episodes. And so that was a bigger kind of emotional catharsis for me. It was like, oh, like he and Susie, not only do they not hate each other, he's also kind of delivering this guy on a plate to her. I think the show really leaves open whether or not that guy has died, because the sequence of shots is you see him point the gun, pull the trigger, the birds go up. You see like the guy close his eyes, birds go up into the air, and then I think you see them turn to look at what has just happened, and then you never see the dead body.
Well, my suspicion for that is actually they seem to have at multiple times laid the groundwork that Susie's brother is going to wake up and get out of this coma. There's a moment where he sort of, when there's violence occurring in the hospital around him, his eyes widen, and there's a couple of moments where Susie expresses, oh, we're moving in the right direction. There's a sense that I think they're going to leave the satisfaction of that man dying to when that brother wakes up in season 2 and allow him to take the killing blow, would be my prediction on where that all ends up.
Yeah, I also think there's a world where that guy isn't killed. Collins, I think is his name, right? That guy doesn't die. And Eddie says, hey, actually, I'm not killing him because we're going to use him as part of this enterprise.
Right.
And that's part of my major plan, and that's how you know I'm a genius at this. So I think they're leaving themselves open for where they want the direction of that storyline to go. But yeah, I do think that the whole brother getting incapacitated is one of the best sequences of the show, right? Like, you always love a good Guy Ritchie, hey, I'm describing to you how you're fucked, right? Like a sequence, right? And that guy is talking to her, the money launderer, and also, by the way, he's like this guy's a real polymath, right? He's not only a boxing promoter / coach or whatever, but he's also into money laundering, and now he wants to take over the whole business. But that sequence where he kind of describes how he's going to screw over this guy, Susie's brother, is just like classic Guy Ritchie. I know he didn't direct that episode. I don't think he did, but like you could totally imagine that being a Guy Ritchie directed episode of like hey, we have this guy who is like basically OP. He's super powered, and he purposely throws fights so that we can use him in situations like this to exact revenge on people like you. Which is like, wow, that's like next level genius thinking, and my mind starts reeling like, wait, is that possible in real life that a guy could do that? like basically like have this guy be super powerful and then purposely throw fights so that when he needs to win he definitely can. It's like, I wonder, like,
we need you to look like the Hulk, but act like Bruce Banner, but also be able to be the Hulk when we
right,
need you to do
yes.
that.
And it's like, would that be useful? Boy, that would take a lot of work. That would take a lot of purposely losing a bunch of fights to make this work. I'm like, my mind is thinking through like the logistics of it all, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I love that sequence. Did you have any favorite moments or sequences that came to mind for you, Patrick?
Well, mostly, I mean, it's like that, like storytelling device is something this show deploys all the time.
Yes.
Of a character is going to talk while the person narrates over actions occurring elsewhere, and I gotta admit, I never got tired of it. Like, it's whether that's, I'm sure it's some combination of it's just a unique form of storytelling that we don't see all that often, or like the stylizations of Ritchie that, yes, he didn't direct every episode here, but I think the show does a really good job of keeping pace with like competent Ritchie stylization throughout the show. It doesn't feel like it falls, we watch that with, like The Sympathizer. Like, what do you do when you have a television show where, by the very nature of the creative at the heart of it, you're going to end up following that visual style. And then what do you do when, for all sorts of good reasons, that person cannot direct every shot and every scene?
Yeah.
It's I think a taller order with like the flourishes of The Sympathizer, but a similar sort of issue in front of you. And I thought this show did a great job of deploying Ritchie techniques at a visual level and on a storytelling level over and over again. They were just really satisfying. I think part of it is just because to have it kind of in a shotgun blast at you is different than, I know Ritchie's a very prolific filmmaker. He's putting out stuff, if not every year, it feels like every other year. Like he's got something else coming, and he's even doing a show like this in parallel with his film work. But I thought they did a great job following in his aesthetic footsteps, and I think it's less than any single one of those were one of my favorites, as much as it's almost like I'm cracking open like a nice, wonderful beer. Like, we're about to watch this scene, this style of storytelling again, because it did it at least once an episode, and every time it was satisfying.
Yeah, I agree completely. And all the episodes feel like they have one creative voice behind them, right? That's
feels
kind
very
of
cohesive.
Very cohesive and well done. So as the season comes to a close, Bobby Glass decides to sell his business, which will allow both him and Eddie to get out. But to everyone's surprise, Eddie decides to work with Susie to put together a bid for the business. They methodically assemble a coalition to get a dollar amount that will be compelling, all while taking out their competition. Only to discover, massive twist, Bobby isn't trying to get out of the business after all. It was a huge test. The season ends with Eddie being given a leadership role in the organization, Eddie and Susie ostensibly executing one of Susie's rivals, while we see Stanley Johnston and Bobby Glass meeting in jail months later. End quote. I don't know why I said end quote. I wrote that.
Nicely done, David.
I'm
Nicely
used to saying
quoting yourself.
I'm used to saying end quote when I get to the end of a thing online. But anyway, yeah. So that's where the show ends. You know, I've been thinking about like our conversation on the Acolyte and how we feel like that show is incomplete. This to me feels like a complete story. Like,
yes,
if we never got a season 2, yes, there's open threads and stuff that they could do, but like this is a complete story. It's like, it's Eddie Horniman thrust into the situation and then eventually deciding, hey, I actually want to run this whole thing, and then he makes a stab at it, and then ultimately is thwarted. That's the thing, is like, I'm not sure how we're supposed to feel at the end because we know so little about Eddie. Now, so there's qualms I have about how it was executed, but at the end of the day, it's a complete story. And if it ended right here, I'd be like, okay, good job. That was a relatively satisfying season of television. But the Acolyte, I don't think is satisfying at all, and that's one of the problems with it. But I'm just bringing this up because this is a contrast to the Acolyte, which we were discussing both today and last week. But yeah, I guess that's how I feel about this ending, which is, yes, it's a complete story, but I also feel like I don't really know how Eddie feels about any of this stuff. Like, if it was me, I'd be super pissed, right? That I put together this offer and it's like, oh, it was a test, and like we don't really see any of that. We don't see Eddie being pissed or Eddie being like, "Egads, I've been thwarted again." Like even seems potentially into it. He's just such a mystery to me. Patrick, do you have any reactions?
Well, and this is also, I'll be curious with the second season whether it chooses to or to not explore this, but running threads of the season in general that it only really touches on, but never quite gets to, is like, seems like the father, like Eddie's father, like the patriarch, was kind of a piece of shit. Like clearly, like his wife was, cheating on him, like had a child with the groundskeeper. There was like a lot of trauma that like Freddie and Eddie have associated with like how they were brought up and different incidents in their life. And those moments where the show tries to like ground you or like bring in that like family history and drama, I don't know how much it works. The show doesn't forward it. It's definitely only something it kind of dips its toe into, and I think that helps explain your own issues with sort of Eddie as a character, and something that I think would become more of a problem in subsequent seasons. Like, character that's like mostly style, very little substance. Like, how far can you really take that before we have to peel back some sort of layer here in order to have more to work with? And all the characters except Eddie have some, at least Freddie, like Freddie acknowledges like he's a fuck up. Like the mother, like obviously feels some remorse and complicated feelings over relationship with the father. Like, it's just, Eddie's got like none of that. Like there's 8 episodes, and by the end of those 8 episodes, we know as much about Eddie in the first 5 minutes of this show than we do at the end. The only difference is he's embroiled in some criminal activity, but there's no interiority whatsoever. You can't just say, I do this for my family. Like, that's not interiority. Like, that's just a line you're saying to get your buddy, your brother Freddie in line. So I assume the show would have to go in that direction at some point. And in some ways, that's at that point, it becomes a kind of a different kind of show. It's not really the breezy show that I watched for 8 episodes. I really need to see Eddie feeling remorse over dragging, like if Freddie dies in season 2 because he got his family into the drug trade. It's a different kind of show.
Yeah. All right. Well, any other thoughts about The Gentleman season 1, Patrick Klepek?
I hope they're able to keep up sort of the clash of the two worlds. Like, now that he is Eddie, this season concludes with him being kind of a criminal mastermind himself, or at least part of a criminal leadership. Part of like the huge fun of this season has been like the aristocrat world and the criminal world and how they humorously overlap. And like I loved those bits. Like, and the moment that the aristocrats become the criminals, do we start to lose an ability to have those worlds like meaningfully contrast against one another? I don't know. I hope they maintain that beyond just, when we cut to the Hornimans, like they're in a castle, because I feel like that contrast between these worlds was a huge part of what made this really entertaining. So hopefully there's other sets of characters and that we get to delve into that maintains that, because it was a huge part of the charm of this season of television.
That reminds me, by the way, there is that one episode where they go to the one of the other lords' manors that is also selling or used to sell drugs for Bobby Glass, and it's all run down and miserable looking, and there's no one there, and it's just like an old guy, and then these gangsters that have moved in, and he's just kind of cool with it because he's like, what, he's bored, he's got nothing better to do, so he's like, I'm just gonna let these. And I thought that was very compelling, I think, because we have in our minds like, oh, it must be so cool to be a lord in England, right? To have this huge house and land. And it's like, actually, sometimes it can be really sad, and these places are very difficult to maintain, and they're very expensive. And maybe you need to turn to criminality because of necessity as opposed to desire, and all this stuff. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But I will say another issue I had with this show is it kind of dispatches of Stanley Johnston a little bit too quickly. Like,
Yeah.
that I really liked the idea of Stanley Johnston going up against Bobby Glass. It's like, oh wow, two formidable foes, each with their own strengths. One who has like ridiculous amounts of money, and the other one who has deep knowledge of the criminal underworld, kind of going up against each other and like what that might look like. And instead, it's like, hey, we got him. The billionaire Stanley Johnson going to jail. It's like, really? Really? Is that how that would play out in real life? Because I have some bad news for you. There are two justice systems. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how it works in the UK. Maybe
Right.
Maybe they don't care if you're a billionaire in the UK, but like in the US, billionaires don't go to jail very often.
Well, but also the way they play him up in the show, for him to be dispatched over like a piece of paper that like an assistant didn't verify. I mean, that just seemed
it's ridiculous.
Especially because you're casting this actor on purpose, right? Like we've talked about in the past how, it seems like he's been it's because of Breaking Bad. There's a lot of shows, productions that end up bringing him in to play a similar version of a character he has already played. We've seen it in Star Wars. We see it here, and he's good at it. Hopefully he likes doing it, and it's not just those are the roles that are being offered, so he's taking them. But if you're gonna do that, like, it's one thing to portray him as actually he's not as smart as he appears. Well, then you have to. There's a high level of execution that has to come with explaining the facade he's created, that actually he's kind of a doofus and he can be easily tricked. There's nothing there to suggest that's what happened. It just sort of seemed like he slipped something past the assistant. And then, got him. And so I didn't find that seemed, in some ways, we want to save him for season 2. And it was a way of just sort of taking him off, moving the piece on the board to somewhere else. Without actually providing a satisfying resolution for who, in many ways, is like the behind the curtain villain of the entire season. And they're dispatched with like a cloud of smoke, which didn't feel worthy of the character or the gravitas of the actor, and why you end up casting them for a role like that.
Absolutely. Well, at the end of the day, I do hope we get more of those like clash of these big kind of families or factions or whatever.
Agreed.
In season 2, because that was some of the more compelling elements of season 1. Overall, though, The Gentleman season 1, a show Patrick Klepek and I had a good time with. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.